Christopher Hoy disappeared on May 19th, 2022.
It's going to be nearly impossible to find somebody in the Ozarks when they disappear.
I hear a truck start up, and so I run up to the front, and Chris's truck isn't there. And I look down, and his wallet's there and his phone's there. I need to find him. This isn't right. Something's not right.
His family is desperate for answers.
I started going through his email, and there were some emails missing. It was very odd. My husband doesn't delete emails.
The Pulaski County Sheriff's Office does a thorough search of the vehicle. The only clue that's recovered is a cigarette butt. Did he have a relationship we don't know about?
This episode of Disappeared retraces Christopher's last known steps.
A K-9 unit is deployed in this case to try to find a scent trail of Chris, and it does hit on one towards the highway.
That only, in my mind, makes me think that he got picked up. Like he doesn't just disappear out of thin air.
I don't see my husband willingly leaving his children. They need to know where their dad is. They need their dad home. I need my husband home.
The more people who know Christopher's story, the greater the chance of bringing him home.
My name is Teresa Hoy. My nephew, Christopher James Hoy, went missing May the 19th, 2022 in Dixon, Missouri, and he's still missing. He was born in Peoria, and he grew up there. I think everybody should know Chris. When he was growing up, he was very energetic. When he gets excited about something, you get excited about it. Always kind of laughing. He would like to make people happy. He was a pitcher in the baseball team. He was pretty good. He also had his own paper route. And once he was on his own, he was working at Caterpillar. But any job that controlled him, he really didn't care for after a while. So then he turned around and he wanted to better himself further. He started buying houses, and then doing what he loved was fixing them up, working with his hands. He had met a lady. He was crazy about her, and they had 2 children. But then all of a sudden, something happened, and I'm not real privy to it. She was nowhere to be found. He went gung-ho and got custody of his 2 kids and started a life, and a fatherhood will change you. And then he met Alicia.
I'm Alicia Hoy. I am Chris's wife. I met Chris at a bar. November 3rd of 2017. I was meeting a friend of mine there, and we were gonna play pool. And Chris is sitting at the bar, and he kind of scoots over, just asking me how my day was, you know, what do I do, and all that. And we just sit and talk, and we talk a lot. Just about everything under the sun. I might have fallen in love with him that night, you know? His kids lived with him, so I met them pretty early on. He seems like this very sweet, caring father, you know? But he didn't meet my daughter, Zoe, until 4 months later.
We've got all you need. Colors, powers, sound effects.
Like the first night we had went over to his house, we sat in the kids' playroom hitting each other with lightsabers. And there were little sticky hands. Like we were throwing them at each other, and then he made fun of me because I got stuck one on the ceiling.
Oh my God.
And Mom was like recording all of it. She had this video and she was just laughing like I've never heard her laugh before.
Dear Lord.
So I had always like prayed for siblings. Like I always wanted a little brother, a little sister, and then I got both. It was really exciting. Like the kids were so cute. It seemed like they were just immediately my siblings. I loved them. And I didn't really know how to feel about having a dad, but I was also super excited about it. And he was just super open. Like he would try to help me whenever possible. It means a lot because I never thought I would have a dad, and he just jumped in.
It was April of 2019 is when we found out we were pregnant. And we had already at that point set a date for the wedding.
Yeah. We're gathered here today to celebrate one of life's greatest moments.
And we had a small backyard ceremony with just the kids. And my cousin officiated.
With this ring, I be wed.
But I couldn't ask for anything more than that. Chris was very excited. He's just hoping for another boy, and he did not get that. But he loves all his kids, and he was ecstatic to have another one join the family. But when I met Chris, he had some rental properties in Peoria, and then he had Airbnbs. So we decided we would grow the rental properties. You know, passive income is a great thing. The Airbnb business was booming then, so we were making decent money until COVID hit.
New York, California, Illinois, and Connecticut all ordering non-essential employees to stay home. Those orders cover 75 million people across the United States.
And then it all kind of fell apart. We lost 10 grand a month. So we made that hard decision together. And we decided, we were gonna cut our losses. We took what we had and we moved here to Missouri. We wanted the homestead with the gardening, the animals. I always had baby goats in mind, and so did he. It just seemed like the next chapter in our story.
My name's Andrew Sheely. I'm a news reporter with Phelps County Focus in Rolla, Missouri. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, we've had this wave of folks moving into the Ozarks who are trying to live this homestead lifestyle. And Chris was part of this migration that's going on right now.
They wanted to be able to grow their own food, have their own animals. I did think it was cool, and they were doing something together that they both love doing, and they just had more big plans for the future. I did stay up in Illinois because I had gotten accepted into nursing school. But by the time I had come down for the first time, they had gotten pretty much everything they needed set up. Like, they had pens for the animals. The house was looking a lot better than the pictures. The kids were super excited to show me their rooms and what they were doing, their toys. Like, I had never seen them so proud of what they had made down here. But I noticed something was off about Chris, and I didn't know what it was. And I asked him if he was okay, and he's like, I'm going through it. And he just seemed a little different.
My name is Blake Potter, and Chris is my fiance's stepdad. Obviously, the family was happy. The kids were happy.
Dad, I like milking the goat.
But moving to Missouri with all of that because of COVID, that puts a stress on everybody, especially with the money loss.
The first couple months we were there, all we did was we settled in. And then I got a job as an ABA therapist part-time. Chris, he's like, I want to homeschool the kids. Like, we were building our dreams. May 19th, 2022. We wake up at 6, we go have our coffee. We do our chores. I take off to work, come home, and there's a severe thunderstorm warning. Our property has a habit of flooding, and we go to the back and we work on preventing from flooding. We're outside, and we're soaking wet because of the rain. And he's like, all right, I'm gonna go take a shower. I said, okay, babe. And I go in and I check on the kids, kind of clean up. And I'm standing at the counter when he comes out. And I'm like, hey, baby, I'm gonna go milk the goats. And he goes, okay, baby. And so I go through the basement, to the garage, down to the basement. And I hear a truck start up and leave. And so I run up to the front. And Chris's truck isn't there. And the gate's open. And so I run inside. Where'd your dad go? My son, he said, I don't know. He told me to go to my room. I'm like, that's all he said? He's like, yeah. And he goes, where'd he go? I said, I don't know, bud, you know? And I go out to the porch and I'm kind of mad, you know, because Chris never leaves. He never leaves the house without giving me a kiss, telling me he loves me. Or giving the kids a kiss, telling them that he loves them, you know? It's routine with him. And I sit on the porch and I call Zoe and I'm like, Chris just left. And he left the gate open. He goes, okay, what'd he take? And I look down at the porch table and his wallet's there and his phone's there. And I'm like, well, he didn't take his wallet or his phone. And I just have this nagging feeling that I need to find him. Because this isn't right. Something's not right. So I call a friend of mine over to watch the kids. And I tell her, I'm like, I gotta go check the river. And it was just like instinct. It was a gut feeling, you know, so if he just needs to get away, I feel like he would go and sit at the river, you know, commune with nature, because that's what he likes to do, you know. So I think that's why I'm thinking, look there, I gotta find my husband. And so I go to the river, it's not even a mile from my house. And I see his truck. So I pull off. I smell honeysuckle, and it's his favorite flower. I walk across the road, and I look in the truck. And it's not locked. The key's in the ignition. There's nothing in there. He's not there. And I look around. There's no footprints. So the river where he parked his truck is actually where we go when we take the kids swimming. I mean, it can get kind of deep.
Given where Chris's truck is found by the Highway 28 bridge by the Gasconade, it looks immediately like an emergency because the Gasconade River is actually one of the deadlier rivers in this area. And the reason why is it's deeper, it's a strong current, and many people have drowned in that. His truck is parked, he's nowhere to be found. Now, given that the river's right there, you have to logically conclude he may have gotten swept up in the river. And the fact that it's swelled up because of a rainstorm makes it all the more dangerous.
So at that moment, every worst case scenario is running through my mind. And I don't know what to think. I don't know what to feel. I don't know what to do. Just everything starts running through my head of what could have possibly happened.
He could be floating downriver, he could be clinging to a log, he could be moments away from drowning. Given the circumstances of Chris's disappearance, time is of the essence, and so the Pulaski County Sheriff's Office responds in full force. But unfortunately at that point, it's so dark, the woods are so dense, there's just not a lot you're going to be able to do if you're searching for a person.
So the next morning, by 9 o'clock, the detective comes over and he talks to me. And he goes, okay, I've got a search team. And I was grateful.
I mean, they put together a team of 50 officers because they know if he is in that river, he might be moments from death. The sooner that they can find him, the more likely it is that he's going to be able to survive.
It was approaching 5 o'clock, so I decided I was going to go ahead and call the detective. He's like, we just got back. So they were there 6 hours or so. And he goes, we searched everywhere we could. We took drones out. They searched 3 miles downstream, 3 or 4 miles upstream, just in case. And he said, we didn't find any signs, we didn't find him.
The river is the initial focus. There's an intensive search made of the river. For 5 miles going down the river, they drag it, they search it, they look for clothing, nothing is found. And 5 miles is key in this case because the Gasconade River is particularly windy. And I mean, it's unlikely that the body is going to float downriver past all of those curves, all of those twists. It would get hung up in branches, it would get stuck in a whirlpool, something. They don't find any clues. Now, if there's no clothing found, if there's no footprints, they're at a dead end.
doesn't make sense why he would leave. Like, why? When Chris gets down, he usually just bounces right back. The events of the last few years did weigh on him quite a bit. But before he disappeared, he wasn't quite as vibrant of a person. You know, the rental businesses were a flop with COVID. And he would tell me, you know, he was sad that he didn't have this empire, you know, that he was trying to create and to leave for his kids.
Chris pretty much had no business anymore. Like, COVID just shut everything down. Like, I know income dropped a lot and bills were just piling up because they didn't have a whole lot to help pay anymore. I just know after COVID really hit, everything just kind of went to hell.
All the houses were all in foreclosure then. And I know it had hurt him bad. He was a proud guy, a proud man. I'm sure he felt ashamed. There's a lot to homesteading. A lot of people think they can just jump right into it, and you can't. It is a lot of work, a lot of money. They homeschooled their kids. So that, on top of everything else, that's a lot of pressure.
Right before he left, like, he was consistently depressed. Like, it didn't seem, from what Mom said, that he bounced back up, or even from the last time I saw him, like, he had just been depressed.
The week before he disappeared, he did tell me that he didn't want to do this anymore. I'm like, do what? I'm like, babe, if there is anything I can do, you know, I'll do it, you know, whatever you need. And he couldn't pinpoint anything. Communication wasn't all that strong, but I felt like there was stuff on his mind. There was something big in his head, and he wasn't sharing in that week. Whether it was, you know, some outside force or just something, his own thoughts, I could never. And like, to this day, I can't pinpoint what was going on. I didn't know what to do. Like, I felt like things had changed, something had changed.
Chris was probably doubting himself for months leading up to his disappearance. He probably had this anxiety building up in himself, this fear, this dread that he was a failure, that he was dragging his family down. And that developed malignantly within himself. He started to doubt whether or not they were going to be able to make it in the Ozarks. And it developed into this overwhelming fear. And what his family was seeing as this sudden break had actually been building up over time for months as Chris started to doubt whether or not the homestead was going to be successful. I think that suicide is something we have to seriously consider in this case.
One of the biggest things I did think at first was suicide, because he left his phone, left his wallet, took his truck down to the river. I don't think that so much anymore, because when he had first met me, I self-harmed a lot. And one of his biggest things that always stuck to me was, do you want me to have to explain to your siblings why they don't have a big sister anymore? And that was always such a big deal to me. I don't think he would ever commit suicide, because he would always fight through whatever was going on.
He wanted to clean out the basement. He wanted to become a notary. He had all these wants, and he had plans. You're not gonna make those plans if you're not gonna try to follow through. At least my husband never made plans without following through. He was very deliberate in his actions.
I don't think he was suicidal. Depressed, most definitely. But suicidal, no. No, I don't think that one bit.
So the night I found his truck at the river, my thought was not that he went to commit suicide. And to this day, it's not. It's not my thought. I don't know what happened, but I don't believe it was suicide. The police did search 10 days after. Had conservation out there, highway patrol, people in boats, you know.
A K-9 unit is deployed in this case to try to find a scent trail of Chris, and it does hit on one. In fact, it leads away from the truck and towards the highway. But the scent trail that the dog picks up suddenly stops.
When you have the K-9 unit come out and they get a scent that leads up to the road, and then it just disappears, that only, in my mind, makes me think that he got picked up. Like, he doesn't just disappear out of thin air.
We don't know who would have picked him up. Like, who, if he was picked up, like, who would have picked him up? And why has no one said anything?
The Pulaski County Sheriff's Office does a thorough search of the vehicle, and there's no evidence of foul play. There's no blood, there's no signs of violence or struggle. The only clue that's recovered is a cigarette butt.
And it wasn't a brand that Chris smokes, wasn't a brand that I smoke. So I thought it was odd. Something was amiss.
This cigarette butt is one of the only clues in this case, and it could be significant. I mean, could this be the key to solving this crime? The cigarette butt being found in Chris's truck opens up the possibility that someone else is involved in this case. Who could that be? Was there somebody that wanted to do him harm?
The fact that his scent was tracked to the road, it tells me that he was picked up. I think there's a likelihood of Chris being forced out of the house, of being lured away, if you will, to protect his family.
What we know is the scent trail that the dog picks up leads to the highway and then it suddenly stops. Now we've got to consider two possibilities there. Now it could be that Chris voluntarily got in a vehicle, or maybe Chris was forcibly put in a vehicle, thrown in the bed of a truck, driven off. The way Chris left his house the day he disappeared is a big red flag. He leaves behind his wallet, he leaves behind his cell phone, he leaves his kids behind. He doesn't say where he's going, and he leaves his gate open. Given the way Chris left, homicide is something you've got to consider.
Apparently our area, it's a place where meth heads frequent. And 6 months before he disappeared, woken up at 4 a.m. and the dogs were barking. Chris goes to the front door and he sees someone leaving our property, walking out of our drive. Down the road, gets into a red car. I don't know if they saw that we were building stuff, so maybe, we either had the money or we had materials they could use or, what have you. I don't know. So my husband, he follows them and, has a confrontation, basically says, told them to stay off our land. It's ours. Like, you don't need to be on it. There's no reason for it. We have livestock, we have animals, we have kids.
The Ozarks is very beautiful, but unfortunately it has a massive drug problem. We had a meth boom starting in the 90s that has not let up. And then within the last 10 years, the opioid crisis has really taken over. And that's really been a 1-2 punch for this region. When Chris and Alicia moved to the Ozarks, they encounter this kind of pecking order that exists in the countryside. We have a lot of drug addicts, we have a lot of crime that is associated with that. And whenever somebody moves here, they start looking for, vulnerabilities. Is this somebody I can rob? Is this somebody I can burglarize? And indeed, they do encounter some of that. They have to deal with somebody on their property who they don't know. What are they doing there? Very likely, that was somebody trying to get a sense of how protective they were. Are they armed? Is this somebody that I can rob? Is this somebody I can burglarize? Do they have valuables? We don't know what it is. And you've got to question, is that a factor in this case?
For like the next 6 or so months, anytime this car would drive by our house, honk, all hours of the night, honking, flipping us off. Like, it was surreal, I guess, because why even be on our property to begin with? But one day, Chris had enough. I go outside and my husband is at the fence. And the guy, you're just screaming at each other. And I can't really make out what's being said until I approach and I hear, "You're lucky you have kids here, otherwise I'd burn your house down." And that he had threatened his life. But then after that, all activity stopped.
We know that Chris and Alicia said that nothing had happened recently involving, disputes with neighbors or any type of run-ins with tweakers or people strung out on opioids, but you've got to consider that. Given where they were living in the rural countryside, you've got to consider that perhaps something came up again.
I've lived down there. I haven't seen anything out of the ordinary, really. I don't really know too much about the situation.
I told the detective, and it took it pretty serious, but nothing really came of that.
I don't think he was forced out of the house or out of his vehicle, because knowing the Chris that I know, he would have done anything and everything to get away from anybody and everybody, or anybody trying to come up on his property. You know, he has weapons. He has rifles, handguns, anything and everything that he would do to protect that family.
Given the lack of leads, the lack of clues in this case, anything could have happened to Chris.
June 2nd, I get a call from the detective saying that he's got the kids' mom on the phone and she wants to come get her kids. Chris's ex hasn't been in the picture for over 1.5 years now. In Peoria, Chris's ex wanted to see the kids. And at that time, she had told him that she had moved in with a guy. And Chris wanted to know his last name. She refused to tell him. And so every other weekend when it was her weekend, she'd ask for the kids, he'd ask for the guy's last name. She'd always refuse. And he goes, until you can tell me a name, you're not going to see the kids. 5 months later, she finally tells him his last name. And he's like, it's been 5 months. You have not been in their lives. You're going in and out like this is going to do more harm than good. And he goes, take me to court. At this point, take me to court. They're in a routine. No. And so she never took him to court. She never stepped foot on our property to see the kids. Or neither did her family. And then we moved to Missouri. So when Chris disappeared, she calls me and she's like, I want my kids. I'm gonna come and get them. I will be there at 8 o'clock in the morning. And I'm like, that's no good. I'm not gonna disrupt their routine like that. I said, you realize you're gonna take them. Their dad just went missing. So they are dealing with the trauma from that. And you're gonna take them from the only family they know. You're gonna take them from their sisters. They're the only mom that they know. She says, I want my kids. And so that night I spend as much time with those kids as I can. And I soak up every minute. And they get a good night's sleep. And they eat breakfast the next morning. And I explain to them what has to happen. At one point, they were screaming at me not to make them go. And so I hand them over. I've never seen either of my kids cry so hard.
I don't really feel comfortable speaking about her too much. I don't have anything really good to say, especially with what's happened after he left.
Unfortunately, we just don't have a lot of information about what this custody dispute was like with his ex-girlfriend. Could that have been a factor in Chris's disappearance? I mean, you have to question.
How did the ex-girlfriend know that Chris went missing? How did she know?
I am not sure how Chris's ex found out that he went missing. When she called me on June 2nd, I asked her how she found out and she wouldn't tell me. She just said she found out. I don't know how she found out, but she did. And we found out on Facebook. She was here in Missouri, an hour away. The weekend he disappeared, mud racing or, four-wheeling or that kind of thing. That's odd. She's so close. And then my husband disappears. There are a lot of unanswered questions there. It makes a person wonder.
Last seen May 19th, 2022. If you have any information, please contact the Pulaski County Sheriff's Department at 573-774-6196.
And any disappearance motive is the central question. I mean, if you're gonna factor in possible foul play, who has a motive to do that? When you look at potential suspects, you've got to consider if they have an ex-girlfriend, did they have a bad breakup? When we look at Chris, we know that he did have this past relationship. We know that they had a bad breakup. We know that there was a custody dispute. There's motive there. Now, does that mean that anyone's guilty? No, but That's a factor that you've got to consider in this case. In my opinion, Chris's ex-girlfriend is suspicious.
The detective said that beyond that initial contact, she wouldn't call him back. It bugs me that no one can get any information out of her.
I'd like to get the detective to start questioning her boyfriend. I do believe something is there, and that's where we're at right now.
It is entirely possible that he has just chosen to voluntarily leave home. Maybe he wanted to start a new life again. And since we know that that cigarette is not the brand that Chris smoked, what that opens up is the possibility of there being another person in that truck. You've got to wonder, who is this person that was smoking this cigarette? Did he have a relationship we don't know about?
I started going through his Facebook, his email conversations, phone calls, and there were some emails missing. It's like up until May 19th, there was no emails. I thought it was very odd that my husband doesn't delete emails, and prior to May 19th, there were no emails, and he used that email regularly. So I thought it was very odd that out of all of this on his phone, it didn't look like he had deleted anything. Facebook was still there, all his messages seemed to be there, but there were no emails.
The cops couldn't do anything about it because they're like, well, if they're deleted, like they're just out there somewhere and there's not really a way of getting them back. But that was really the biggest thing, was just that chunk of emails missing.
First and foremost, Chris would never have an affair when he's in love with someone, and we were in love. His past relationships, every single past relationship, had ended with the woman cheating on him. And I know how devastating that is, and he would not do that himself. There was not another woman.
At first I thought, okay, if something happened with him and Leash, or the homestead was too much, then he might have ran a little bit to get away.
Chris was a guy who was getting into his mid-30s, and it's not rare at all for men who get into their early 30s to have a midlife crisis and run away from home. That's not rare at all. That actually happens all the time. It's something you've got to consider. It's going to be nearly impossible to find somebody in the Ozarks when they disappear. It's really this perfect place for a disappearance. It's very rural, it's rough ground. Not a lot of people live here, which means there's not going to be a lot of witnesses. There's no surveillance footage. Given all that, the chances of him being found are very remote.
9 months after Chris's disappearance, we moved down here to Missouri. And in March of 2023, I went to go for a job interview in Lebanon. And when I went in for the interview, I left, and I'm driving in the left lane, and I see somebody in a plumbing truck to the right of me. And it looks just like Chris. He acting like Chris. He was in the driver's seat, like rocking back and forth, laughing. He looked so much like Chris. By the time everything clicked in my head, I was taking the exit and he pulled into the gas station. But what if it was? What if it was Chris and I just missed my shot to catch him?
It does add some weight to this idea that maybe he is alive. Maybe he did voluntarily disappear, want to start a new life. Maybe he ran away with somebody.
I need to call the detective. I gotta find my husband.
If you knew it looked like Chris, you knew he was missing, why didn't you take the time to walk up and say, hey, Chris? Or actually follow that plumber's van and just walk up and, act like you were an old friend and see if it was him. My thoughts are, you saw him, you didn't care to go chase after him? If I saw him, I'd have been jumping in my truck, and I don't care if they want to list me as a stalker or what. I'd have been on that van's tail all the way down. If I saw him leaving, I would have been right into my truck and following it.
I should have stopped to get gas because I kind of hold regret. Like I should put more thought into that. Because like, what if it was him? And I stop at this same gas station every night now after I get off work, hoping to see that van. To this day, I still haven't found this van. I've looked everywhere. It's like it just disappeared.
But there have been a couple sightings of Chris, my daughter's boyfriend, Blake. Then I was in the feed store a few weeks later, and the same lady who keeps this poster up, she's like, I had a customer come in and said he could have swore he saw Chris in Lebanon. That's 2 sightings in that same town. I couldn't wrap my head around it.
The sightings have all been so close to us, only 50 minutes away, and they definitely brought us hope, but like, why is he so close and he hasn't said anything?
Unfortunately, a lot of these sightings just didn't have a lot of details, and that means that there's really not anything to follow up on. It's just this noise.
So I called the detective, didn't follow through with the sightings, and we're coming up on the year mark in May, and I call him and I said, okay, it's been a few months. What's it gonna take to get you to look into this? Well, it's really hard to, look for someone if we don't have any identifying information. So have you contacted these people? And at that point, I think he just kind of gave me a non-committal answer because I can't tell you if he did or not.
I do believe that Pulaski Police Department down in Missouri dropped the ball big time, but we're not going to give up.
From an investigation standpoint, what else is there to do? I mean, no body has been found, no clue has been found. There's only random reports of sightings. What do you do if you're a detective? It may be that the law enforcement is thinking that he voluntarily disappeared.
When I hear about the sightings, it's actually really hard for me to believe that he'd be so close, but he's not at home. And I don't know what to think of it. Because that's not my husband. My husband would never be so close, yet so far away from his family. So, I honestly don't know. I don't know what to believe and I don't know how to feel about it. I really don't. I don't see my husband willingly leaving his children. And even, if we didn't have such a good marriage, which we did, he wouldn't have done that to those kids. He wouldn't have left those kids. And so I don't think this was his choice.
As this case hits the 1-year mark, there haven't been any new developments. And we really don't know how active the investigation is. It's more important now than ever to get this story out there, because getting Chris's face out there could be the key to solving this. And it's up to the media to help make that happen.
It's been 14 months and I haven't quit looking for my husband, and I won't. My kids deserve answers. I deserve answers. But it's really hard to take care of kids if you don't take care of yourself. And it's hard to find your husband if you're not taking care of yourself. So I had to make a decision. I could let this kill me, or I could let it make me stronger. And I chose to let it make me stronger.
I believe he was stressed and depressed, and maybe he just needed time. Do I think he's hurt? No. I don't believe he was forced to do anything. I don't think anybody can give anybody a clear answer on what it was.
The only thing I don't believe happened for sure was suicide. I absolutely do not think he committed suicide. I think it's possible it could have been foul play, but I also think it's possible that it was a mental breakdown and he left with the intentions of coming back. He just needed a break, but A year and a half later, where is he and why has no one found him?
This is a case that hasn't gotten a lot of traction. It hasn't gone viral. It hasn't gotten into the major media markets in the state, but at this point, there just isn't any evidence to give a clear picture of what happened to Chris. I mean, this case is truly a mystery.
Manchester has a way of swallowing sound after midnight. The last buses groan through damp streets, neon signs flicker against rain-darkened pavement, and rows of brick houses settle into an uneasy silence that feels almost alive. On nights like these, the city appears ordinary. A young couple laughs outside a pub before disappearing into the cold. Factory workers finish late shifts with tired eyes and aching hands. Teenagers hurry home, promising worried parents they won't be long. Nothing about the streets suggests that someone is already watching from the shadows, patiently waiting for a single moment of opportunity. Years later, investigators would retrace countless footsteps through these same neighborhoods, measuring distances, comparing timelines, studying faded maps and forgotten alleyways. They would realize something deeply unsettling. The places where innocents disappeared were never remote forests or abandoned country roads. They were ordinary streets where people walked every day, places where children played, where neighbors recognized one another, where families believed they were safe simply because home was only a few minutes away. That illusion would not survive. Long before newspapers found a name to place above the headlines, before frightened residents began locking their doors a little earlier each evening, there was only a growing feeling that something wasn't right. A daughter failed to come home. A friend waited at a bus stop that remained empty. A bedroom light stayed on until sunrise because a mother refused to believe she would never hear footsteps climbing the stairs again. The city searched for explanations that made sense. Perhaps she had run away. Perhaps she had met someone unexpectedly. Perhaps there had been an accident. Hope has an extraordinary ability to postpone unbearable truth. Families cling to ordinary explanations because the alternative is impossible to imagine. They replay the final conversation again and again, searching for a sentence they should have questioned, a warning they somehow missed. Every passing hour becomes both a source of fear and a reason to keep believing. But while those families searched, someone else continued walking through Manchester with remarkable calm. He blended effortlessly into the background. He did not look like the monster people imagine when they hear the word serial killer. There were no dramatic disguises. No secret underground lair. No grand declarations of evil. He was simply another face in a working-class city, another man who could stand in a crowded street without drawing a second glance. The greatest danger was not that he looked frightening. It was that he looked ordinary. Ordinary enough to pass unnoticed. Ordinary enough for strangers to lower their guard. Ordinary enough to disappear again before anyone understood what had happened. The violence itself was sudden, intimate, and brutally personal. There was no emotional distance between killer and victim. Every attack required physical closeness. Every decision demanded conscious intent. These were not crimes committed in panic or desperation. They unfolded over terrifying minutes in which one person fought desperately for life while another refused to let compassion interrupt his purpose. Those final moments can never truly be reconstructed. Police reports preserve injuries. Court records preserve evidence. Newspapers preserve dates. Yet none of them can fully capture the overwhelming fear of realizing that the familiar streets leading home have suddenly become a prison with no escape. None of them can describe the silent calculations racing through a young mind searching desperately for any chance to survive. For the families left behind, time split into two lives. There was life before the disappearance. And there was everything that followed. Birthdays became reminders instead of celebrations. Empty chairs carried unbearable weight. Christmas mornings arrived with unopened gifts that would never be claimed. Every ordinary milestone transformed into another quiet confirmation that someone precious had been stolen forever. Meanwhile, Manchester continued moving. Factories opened before dawn. School children filled the sidewalks. Football crowds packed stadiums. Life has a cruel habit of continuing, even while grief convinces the brokenhearted that the entire world should have stopped. As investigators struggled to connect scattered evidence, rumors spread faster than facts. People whispered in pubs, exchanged theories across garden fences, and warned daughters not to walk alone after dark. Some believed the attacks were unrelated. Others insisted the city was hiding something far worse than officials admitted. Fear grew not because people knew the truth, but because uncertainty allows imagination to create horrors even greater than reality. The truth, when it finally emerged, proved horrifying enough. The man responsible had not chosen victims because of long-standing personal hatred. They were young women whose paths crossed his at moments of terrible vulnerability. One was walking home. Another disappeared after a celebration. Another simply expected to reach home safely before the night was over. Ordinary decisions. Ordinary routines. Ordinary trust. Nothing about those evenings suggested they would become part of criminal history. That is perhaps the most disturbing lesson hidden inside this case. Extraordinary evil rarely announces itself with theatrical warnings. More often, it waits quietly within ordinary surroundings, concealed beneath familiar faces and everyday routines. It exists beside normal life until a single decision, a single encounter, or a single chance meeting changes everything. The story you are about to hear is not merely the story of a killer. It is the story of 3 young lives interrupted before adulthood had truly begun. It is the story of parents who spent decades carrying questions no courtroom could ever answer. It is the story of investigators who came painfully close to stopping a murderer before he claimed another victim. And above all, it is a reminder that behind every infamous criminal nickname lies something far more important: real people whose futures were erased, whose families never stopped counting the years they should have had together. Before the headlines called him the Beast of Manchester, before detectives uncovered the pattern hidden beneath seemingly disconnected tragedies, before a courtroom finally exposed the man behind the fear, there were only 3 daughters making ordinary journeys through an ordinary city. Unaware that somewhere in the darkness, a stranger had already decided that they would never make it home. Morning arrives differently after a disappearance. The sun still rises over rows of red brick terraces. Delivery trucks still rumble through narrow streets. Factory whistles still call workers to another shift. From a distance, nothing appears to have changed. But inside one house, breakfast remains untouched. A bedroom door stays half open. A coat hangs exactly where it was left the evening before. Every familiar object suddenly becomes evidence of an absence too large to ignore. Someone begins making phone calls. A friend answers with sleepy confusion. No, she never came here. Another relative checks their spare room. No, they haven't seen her. Employers are contacted. Neighbors are questioned. Hospitals are called one after another, each conversation ending with the same mixture of relief and disappointment. She isn't there. At first, everyone searches for ordinary explanations because ordinary explanations are easier to survive. Maybe she missed the last bus. Maybe she stayed with a friend without telling anyone. Maybe she simply needed time alone. The human mind reaches for hope even when hope grows thinner with every passing hour. But there comes a moment in every missing person's case when the atmosphere changes. It is impossible to describe precisely. No clock announces it. No official statement marks the transition. Yet everyone involved feels it. Conversations become quieter. Smiles disappear. Every unanswered question begins pointing toward a possibility nobody wants to say aloud. Somewhere in Manchester during the mid-1970s, that moment happened more than once. Each family believed their nightmare was unique. Each investigation began as an isolated tragedy. Each detective initially searched for answers within a single victim's world. Only much later would those separate stories begin to overlap like pieces of a puzzle no one wanted to complete. Looking back now, hindsight creates the dangerous illusion that everything should have been obvious. We imagine detectives connecting clues with effortless precision. We expect patterns to reveal themselves immediately. Reality is rarely so generous. Real investigations unfold through exhaustion, uncertainty, contradictory witness statements, overlooked details, and countless dead ends. Every decision is made without knowing which clue will matter months or even years later. That uncertainty became one of the greatest advantages for the man responsible. He did not leave behind a dramatic signature designed to announce himself. Instead, he left confusion. Different locations, different circumstances, different victims whose only shared characteristic was that they found themselves alone at the wrong moment. The crimes appeared scattered across both time and place, allowing coincidence to disguise intention. While police searched for connections, he continued living among the people searching for him. He walked the same pavements. He entered the same shops. He passed officers who had no reason to stop him. Perhaps that is what makes this case so unsettling even decades later. The distance between ordinary life and unimaginable violence was measured not in miles, but in moments. A single missed bus. A shortcut through familiar streets. A walk home after work. A celebration that lasted just a little longer than expected. Tiny decisions, insignificant on their own, quietly redirected 3 young lives toward the same unimaginable ending. History often remembers killers through sensational nicknames. Newspapers create labels because they fit neatly into headlines. They simplify horror into something readers can recognize instantly. But names like the Beast of Manchester risk creating a myth larger than the reality. They can accidentally transform an ordinary criminal into something almost supernatural. There was nothing supernatural about Trevor Hardy. His crimes did not require impossible intelligence. They did not depend on elaborate technology or masterful planning. Instead, they relied on something far more disturbing: opportunity, violence, and the assumption that no one would connect the pieces quickly enough to stop him. That reality forces an uncomfortable question. How many dangerous people escape attention simply because they appear unremarkable? The answer is impossible to know. What is known is that many violent offenders spend years hidden behind routines that seem completely ordinary. They have neighbors. They hold conversations. They laugh at jokes. They stand in queues. Their appearance offers no reliable warning. Evil rarely introduces itself before demanding a price. For the families in this story, that price was immeasurable. Photographs became priceless possessions. Old birthday cards gained unbearable emotional weight. Voicemails did not exist in those years, leaving only fading memories of familiar voices that grew harder to recall with every passing season. Parents clung to tiny details, the way their daughters laughed, the songs they hummed without realizing it, the habits that once seemed ordinary but became irreplaceable after they were gone. No verdict could ever return those moments. Justice, when it finally arrived, would answer certain questions while leaving others forever unresolved. Why these victims? Why those nights? Could another decision by investigators have prevented the final murder? Those questions would echo through interviews, courtrooms, newspaper articles, and private conversations for decades. Some found partial answers. Others never did. Because true crime is rarely satisfying in the way fiction is. Real life leaves loose ends. Real grief has no closing chapter. Real families continue living long after public attention moves elsewhere. As this story unfolds, there will be moments that feel almost unbelievable. There will be investigative mistakes that seem impossible in retrospect. There will be missed opportunities that continue to frustrate criminologists and historians even today. Yet every event happened within the limitations of its time, when forensic science lacked many of the tools now considered routine, and when investigators often relied as much on instinct as on evidence. Those limitations mattered. They created delays. Those delays created opportunities. And those opportunities allowed a violent man to remain free long enough to claim another victim. By the time the full truth emerged, Manchester had already been changed. Streets that once felt familiar carried darker memories. Families who had trusted the ordinary rhythm of everyday life discovered how fragile that sense of safety could be. Detectives would eventually uncover the man responsible, but solving the case could never erase the months of uncertainty, the years of mourning, or the futures that had already been taken away. This is where the story truly begins, not with the arrest, not with the confession, and not inside a courtroom, But in a city that believed it understood itself, just before 3 ordinary lives were drawn into one of the most haunting murder cases Manchester had ever known. There is a quiet misconception that serial murder begins with the first body that is found. It doesn't. It begins much earlier, in moments so ordinary that no one remembers them until it is far too late. A stranger pauses beneath a street lamp and watches people pass. A familiar shortcut becomes part of someone's routine. A predator learns which streets empty first after midnight and which corners disappear into darkness before anyone notices. None of these moments make tomorrow's newspaper. None of them seem important. Yet this is where tragedy quietly gathers momentum. Manchester in the mid-1970s was a city built on resilience. Generations had grown up through hardship, economic uncertainty, and long hours of physical labor. Families looked after one another. Neighbors recognized familiar faces. Children learned which roads to avoid after dark, but danger was still imagined as something distant, something that belonged in stories from other places. People believed that if they were sensible, if they stayed close to home, if they followed the routines they had always known, they would return safely. For 3 young girls, that belief would be shattered forever. They did not know each other. They came from different families, lived different lives, dreamed different dreams. Yet history would bind their names together in a way no one could have imagined. Not because of who they were, but because of one man who crossed their paths. If you were to stand in those neighborhoods today, you would see traffic flowing through streets that have changed with time. New buildings stand where empty lots once existed. Shops have closed, reopened, or disappeared altogether. Children still laugh in nearby parks. People hurry home carrying groceries, checking their watches, answering phones, thinking about tomorrow rather than yesterday. Most would never guess that beneath the ordinary rhythm of the city lies a history stained by fear. Places remember. Even when people forget. A canal reflects the same grey sky. A narrow alley still catches the evening wind. A quiet residential street still falls silent after midnight. The landscape remains, carrying memories that cannot be photographed but somehow never completely disappear. Cases like this are often remembered because of their brutality. They appear in documentaries, books, and newspaper archives, reduced to dates, locations, and evidence exhibits. Yet behind every page of official records exists another story that is far less visible. It is the story of interrupted futures. A birthday that was never celebrated. A career that never began. A family that never had the chance to grow. A lifetime reduced to a handful of police files and courtroom transcripts. That is why this story deserves to be told carefully. Not to glorify the man responsible. Not to transform violence into entertainment. But to remember the lives that existed before fear consumed the headlines. Because before they became victims, they were simply daughters. Friends. Classmates. Young women standing at the edge of adulthood, believing they had years stretching endlessly ahead. They could not know that somewhere nearby, another ordinary evening was unfolding for someone else. Someone whose thoughts moved in a direction invisible to everyone around him. There are monsters who roar. And there are monsters who whisper. The second kind is often far more dangerous. They move without attracting attention. They wait instead of rushing. They observe instead of announcing themselves. Their greatest weapon is patience. Trevor Hardy never needed crowds to fear him while he walked the streets. Fear came later, after investigators pieced together what had already happened. During the crimes themselves, he benefited from anonymity, from the simple fact that nobody looks twice at a stranger walking home at night. Perhaps that is the most chilling truth hidden inside this case. The victims never had the opportunity to recognize the danger before it was too late. There was no warning carried by his appearance. No unmistakable signal telling them to run. Only another face passing through the darkness. Only another ordinary moment. Until suddenly, it wasn't. Over the course of this story, we will examine not only the crimes themselves but also the decisions surrounding them, the investigative breakthroughs, the missed chances, the forensic limitations, and the painful reality that one arrest came too late to save another life. We will meet families forced to endure unimaginable loss, detectives struggling against incomplete evidence, and a criminal whose own arrogance would eventually become one of the keys to exposing the truth. But before justice could enter the picture, before confessions, courtroom testimony, and prison walls, there was only uncertainty. A city asking questions. Families refusing to give up hope. Investigators following leads that dissolved into nothing. And somewhere within that uncertainty, a killer convinced that he had already learned the most dangerous lesson of all, that he could get away with murder. He was wrong. It would take time. It would demand patience. It would cost far more than anyone should ever have had to pay. But eventually, the silence surrounding these crimes would begin to crack. Hidden beneath missed opportunities and unanswered questions were fragments of truth waiting to be uncovered. One by one, those fragments would expose not only the identity of the man responsible but also a haunting reality. Some of the most devastating tragedies are not inevitable. Sometimes they grow from a single mistake, a single overlooked clue, a single decision that seems insignificant until history reveals its consequences. And when that truth finally emerged, Manchester would be forced to confront a question with no comforting answer. How close had they come to stopping him before he killed again? That question would haunt detectives. It would haunt families. And long after the courtroom emptied and the headlines faded, it would continue to haunt the city itself. Because this is not merely the story of how a serial killer was caught. It is the story of how 3 ordinary journeys home became 3 permanent scars on a city's memory, and how the search for justice began long before anyone realized they were hunting a murderer. Manchester, England. The winter of 1974 settled over the city like a blanket of damp grey wool. Long before dawn, chimneys breathed thin columns of smoke into an overcast sky, and by late afternoon the fading daylight had already surrendered to darkness. It was a city that carried the marks of its industrial past on every street corner. Endless rows of red brick terraced houses stretched beside narrow roads polished by years of rain. Textile mills still dominated parts of the skyline, while factories and warehouses filled the air with the metallic scent of machinery and oil. For the people who lived there, life rarely paused. Men left home before sunrise carrying lunch tins worn smooth by years of use. Women balanced work with raising families, stretching every pound as Britain struggled through economic uncertainty. Teenagers dreamed of lives larger than the neighborhoods they had grown up in, but most still believed the streets around them were familiar enough to trust. The Manchester of the mid-1970s was neither glamorous nor hopeless. It was practical. People worked hard because they had little choice. Neighbors borrowed sugar from one another without hesitation. Children played football in narrow streets until someone shouted that dinner was ready. On Friday evenings, pubs filled with laughter as workers tried to forget another exhausting week, while dance halls and local clubs offered young people a brief escape from routines that often felt predetermined. There was comfort in familiarity. Everyone seemed to know someone who knew someone else. Faces repeated themselves at bus stops, corner shops, and market stalls. In communities built on routine, strangers were noticed, but only briefly. A man walking alone after dark was simply another resident heading home. Technology had not yet transformed daily life. There were no mobile phones tucked into coat pockets, no satellite navigation guiding every journey, no social media timelines preserving the final hours before someone disappeared. If a teenager missed the last bus, there was no quick message to reassure worried parents. If someone was delayed, families waited beside the telephone, hoping it would ring. Missing person investigations often began with uncertainty because communication itself depended on chance. Police relied heavily on witness statements, handwritten reports, physical evidence, and patient detective work. Every interview required knocking on doors. Every lead demanded hours of travel and conversation. Information moved at the speed of people rather than machines. For most residents, however, these limitations hardly mattered. Crime existed, certainly. Burglaries, robberies, drunken fights outside pubs, vandalism committed by restless teenagers, these were unfortunate but familiar realities of urban life. Parents warned daughters to avoid poorly lit streets whenever possible, but those warnings belonged to common sense rather than constant fear. Young women still walked home after work. Friends still said goodbye outside bus stations with the expectation that everyone would arrive safely. The city was imperfect, yet predictable. That sense of predictability would prove dangerously fragile. The neighborhoods connected to this story shared an unmistakably working-class character. Streets were lined with modest houses whose windows glowed warmly against cold evenings. Local shops closed early. Streetlights cast pools of amber light across wet pavement, leaving stretches of darkness between them where visibility disappeared almost completely. On rainy nights, reflections from those lamps shimmered across slick cobblestones, creating an illusion of movement even when no one was there. Footsteps echoed farther than expected. Passing cars briefly illuminated empty alleyways before disappearing around corners, returning the streets to silence. For someone walking home alone, those moments rarely felt threatening. They were simply part of life in Manchester. Most evenings passed without incident. Most strangers remained exactly that, strangers sharing the same city for a few quiet minutes before continuing in different directions. It is easy, decades later, to imagine the city through the lens of what eventually happened. History encourages that mistake. Once we know the ending, every dark alley seems sinister, every lonely street appears filled with hidden danger. Reality was more complicated. The overwhelming majority of people moving through Manchester each night were ordinary workers, students, neighbors, friends, and family members trying to get home before the weather turned worse. Fear had not yet settled over the city. Suspicion had not yet replaced trust. Even the police viewed each violent crime as an individual event unless evidence suggested otherwise. The idea that a serial predator might be stalking young women was not the immediate conclusion anyone reached. Detectives worked within the information available to them, and that information was often frustratingly incomplete. Witness memories conflicted. Physical evidence deteriorated in rain and mud. Forensic science was advancing, but many techniques that modern investigators now consider routine either did not exist or remained in their infancy. DNA analysis was still years away. Surveillance cameras were rare. A criminal who avoided obvious mistakes could disappear back into ordinary life with alarming ease. That reality shaped every decision investigators would later make. Manchester itself seemed built on contrasts. During daylight, markets buzzed with conversation. Double-decker buses carried office workers, students, and shoppers through crowded streets. School children in uniforms hurried home before evening settled in. Yet after dark, especially during the colder months, entire neighborhoods seemed to empty almost at once. Curtains closed against the cold. Television flickered behind living room windows. The sound of footsteps became rare enough to notice. Distance felt greater at night, even between streets only a few hundred yards apart. For young people, however, night also represented freedom. Weekend dances, birthday celebrations, pub shifts, seasonal parties, and evenings with friends created memories that felt far more important than early curfews. Independence arrived gradually, measured not by age alone but by trust. Being allowed to walk home alone was a milestone for many teenagers. It signaled growing adulthood. Parents worried, certainly, but they also understood that children could not remain children forever. None of them imagined that ordinary independence could become a fatal vulnerability. The years between 1974 and 1976 were marked by uncertainty across Britain. Economic struggles, inflation, industrial disputes, and political tension shaped daily conversation, yet these national concerns existed alongside the intimate rhythms of family life. Bills still needed paying. Birthdays still needed celebrating. Christmas lights still appeared in windows despite financial hardship. Communities adapted because adaptation was what they had always done. Against that backdrop, one unknown man moved through the same streets without attracting attention. He did not stand apart from the city. He blended into it. He understood its rhythms, its quiet corners, the times when workers finished late shifts, when buses became less frequent, when streets emptied just enough for opportunity to appear. Whether those observations were deliberate calculations or habits developed over time, they gave him something deeply dangerous: familiarity. He knew the city. The city did not know him. That imbalance would become one of the defining features of the investigation. Detectives searched for someone hidden not by distance but by normality. The person they sought did not vanish into remote countryside or flee overseas after every crime. He remained close, living among the same communities shaken by the murders, hearing the same rumors, reading the same newspaper headlines, perhaps even joining conversations about the fear spreading through Manchester. It is an unsettling thought, but history repeatedly reminds us that predators often hide in plain sight. They exploit routine because routine encourages people to lower their guard. Familiar streets create confidence. Familiar faces inspire little curiosity. Every uneventful journey home reinforces the belief that tomorrow's journey will be equally safe. Until one night, it isn't. This was the Manchester that forms the backdrop of our story, not a city defined by violence, but one defined by ordinary lives. That distinction matters because understanding what was lost requires understanding what existed beforehand. Before detectives assembled timelines, before journalists searched archives, before courtrooms filled with evidence, there was simply a community moving through everyday life, unaware that within its familiar streets, the foundations of one of Manchester's most haunting criminal cases were already being laid. If you had walked through Manchester during those years with no knowledge of what history would later record, nothing about the city would have seemed extraordinary. The streets carried the familiar rhythm of working-class Britain. Bakers opened before sunrise. Milk bottles appeared quietly on front doorsteps in the early morning hours. Bus conductors greeted regular passengers by name, and children in oversized school uniforms hurried through the cold with scarves wrapped tightly around their faces. Life was repetitive, but there was comfort in repetition. The predictability of each day created the feeling that tomorrow would unfold much like today. For young people, especially teenagers beginning to taste independence, Manchester offered both freedom and limitation. There were cinemas where the newest films drew long queues on weekends, local dance halls where popular songs echoed late into the evening, pubs that employed young workers eager to earn their own wages, and small shopping districts that became gathering places after school or work. A night out rarely felt dangerous. Parents expected their children to return a little late now and then. Missing the last bus was inconvenient, not terrifying. Walking home with friends beneath rows of orange streetlights was simply part of growing up. The city's transportation system reflected that slower era. Buses connected neighborhoods, but schedules became less frequent after dark. Taxis were available, though often considered an unnecessary expense for working families. Many people simply walked. Distances that seem considerable today were accepted as routine. 15 or 20 minutes on foot after finishing work hardly attracted a second thought. Familiar routes became almost automatic. People crossed the same intersections every evening, passed the same corner shops, nodded at the same neighbors locking their front doors. Routine creates confidence. Confidence creates predictability. And predictability, in the wrong hands, becomes opportunity. The weather rarely made those journeys easier. Manchester's reputation for rain was well deserved. Even when heavy storms failed to arrive, a fine mist often settled over the city, dampening coats, darkening pavements, and softening the edges of streetlights until everything seemed wrapped in a pale halo. Winter evenings carried a penetrating cold that crept through gloves and scarves. Breath lingered in the air for a moment before disappearing into darkness. Shoes clicked against wet pavement, the sound echoing farther than expected through quiet residential streets. On nights like those, people naturally hurried home. Heads lowered against the wind. Hands buried inside coat pockets. Eyes focused more on escaping the weather than observing strangers passing in the opposite direction. It was a city where anonymity came easily. Not because Manchester was enormous by global standards, but because ordinary life encouraged people to mind their own business. Seeing an unfamiliar face rarely raised suspicion. Thousands of workers traveled across different districts every day. Friends visited relatives. Couples returned from evenings out. Shift workers finished at hours that seemed unusual to everyone except those who shared the same schedules. A lone figure walking through the night blended effortlessly into the landscape. This atmosphere shaped the investigation long before investigators realized it. Every witness statement carried uncertainty. "I think I saw someone. He was wearing a dark coat. It might have been around 10 o'clock. He walked in that direction. I think." Memory is never as reliable as people hope, especially when recalling moments that seemed completely ordinary at the time. Few people pay close attention to strangers unless given a reason. By the time detectives began asking detailed questions, days or even weeks had often passed. Faces blurred together. Clothing became impossible to distinguish. Timelines shifted as conversations and assumptions quietly altered recollections. The city itself offered little assistance. Unlike modern urban centers filled with surveillance cameras, Manchester in the mid-1970s left very few silent witnesses behind. There were no digital recordings capturing every street corner. No mobile phone data revealing who had traveled where. No electronic transactions creating minute-by-minute timelines. Investigators relied on shoe leather, patience, notebooks filled with handwritten observations, and endless conversations with residents who desperately wanted to help but often possessed only fragments of useful information. Every missing detail expanded the mystery. Every unanswered question extended the investigation. And somewhere within that uncertainty, the man responsible continued believing he remained invisible. Yet the story of Manchester during this period cannot be told solely through fear. It must also be understood through resilience. Communities looked after one another in quiet, practical ways. If an elderly neighbor failed to open curtains one morning, someone knocked on the door. If children scraped their knees playing football, nearby mothers appeared almost instantly with bandages and comforting words. Families celebrated birthdays in small living rooms crowded with relatives. Weddings filled local churches with laughter. Christmas decorations brightened streets otherwise dominated by grey skies and brick walls. There was warmth beneath the city's rough exterior. Perhaps that is why the murders struck so deeply. They violated more than individual lives. They challenged an entire community's belief about itself. The idea that such violence could emerge from within familiar neighborhoods was difficult to accept. Evil belonged somewhere else. It belonged in sensational newspaper stories from distant cities. It belonged in fiction. It did not belong on streets where people recognized the local postman or exchanged greetings while waiting for the morning bus. As news of each tragedy spread, conversations slowly changed. Parents who once allowed daughters to walk home without hesitation began offering to meet them after work. Friends started traveling together instead of alone. Curtains were pulled aside more often whenever footsteps echoed outside after dark. Small precautions replaced quiet confidence. No official announcement was needed. Fear has a way of rewriting daily habits without asking permission. Still, despite growing concern, few residents imagined they were witnessing the early stages of a serial murder investigation. The crimes appeared separated by time and circumstance. Rumors circulated, naturally, but rumors often outpaced evidence. Some believed unrelated offenders were responsible. Others blamed random acts of violence fueled by alcohol or robbery. Without clear public information, speculation filled every gap. Detectives faced the same uncertainty. They understood they were confronting horrific crimes. What remained unclear was whether those crimes belonged to one offender or several. That distinction would influence every decision they made. Every hour spent pursuing the wrong theory meant another hour during which the real killer remained free. As the seasons changed, Manchester continued living between ordinary routines and growing unease. Markets still opened each morning. School bells still rang. Football supporters still packed stadiums on weekends, filling trains and buses with chants loud enough to drown out darker conversations. Life refused to stop. But beneath that familiar rhythm, something had shifted. People glanced over their shoulders a little more often. A walk home felt slightly longer than before. Silence carried a different weight. No one could yet measure the full scale of what had begun, but the city's sense of certainty had already started to fracture. In time, investigators would reconstruct maps, compare timelines, examine forgotten evidence, and discover that these ordinary streets had witnessed extraordinary cruelty. They would learn that beneath the routine patterns of daily life, another pattern had been quietly forming, one invisible to almost everyone until 3 young lives had already been taken. And by then, the question was no longer whether Manchester had changed. It was how much more the city would lose before the truth finally emerged. Every city carries 2 identities. There is the one people see in daylight, shaped by routine, familiarity, and the comforting rhythm of ordinary life. Then there is the version that emerges after sunset, when streets empty, familiar landmarks become silhouettes, and distance seems to stretch just a little farther than it did only hours before. In the Manchester of the mid-1970s, those 2 identities existed side by side, separated only by the fading of the afternoon light. During the day, the city felt grounded in work. Smoke drifted above factory roofs, buses rolled steadily through busy streets, and market vendors called out to passing customers. Housewives compared prices at local shops. School children spilled onto pavements in noisy groups, their laughter bouncing off brick walls. Elderly neighbors watched the world from lace-curtained windows, exchanging small waves with people they had known for years. It was not a wealthy city, but it was a connected one. Familiarity was its strength. At night, that familiarity became less certain. The same streets that had been crowded only a few hours earlier emptied with surprising speed. Shop shutters rattled closed. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement in uneven patches of amber. In many neighborhoods, the only sounds came from distant traffic, the occasional train, or footsteps echoing through the cold air before disappearing into silence. For someone walking home alone, those sounds could be strangely comforting. They were proof that the city was still alive. But they also carried another truth. If footsteps suddenly stopped, if someone called out from the darkness, if a struggle began beyond the reach of the nearest street lamp, there might be no one close enough to hear. That was one of the quiet realities of urban life in the 1970s. Communities were close-knit, yet moments of complete isolation still existed. A person could be only a few hundred yards from home and still find themselves entirely alone. Those brief windows of vulnerability were invisible to everyone except the people who unknowingly entered them, and perhaps to one man who had learned exactly where they existed. Trevor Hardy did not operate in an unfamiliar environment. Manchester was his city. Its streets, canals, railway lines, industrial estates, and residential neighborhoods were part of the landscape he moved through every day. He understood where people gathered and where they disappeared. He knew which routes remained busy late into the evening and which became deserted shortly after pubs closed or bus services slowed. Whether that knowledge came from conscious planning or years of ordinary observation, it gave him an advantage that investigators would only fully appreciate later. The city itself became part of the story. Not because Manchester created violence, but because its geography shaped opportunity. A quiet towpath beside a canal. An empty construction site hidden behind temporary fencing. Poorly lit streets where visibility vanished beyond the next pool of orange light. Vacant lots waiting for redevelopment. These were ordinary features of an industrial city adapting to change. Individually, they meant very little. Together, they formed a landscape where someone with violent intentions could disappear into darkness far more easily than most residents ever realized. The police of that era faced challenges difficult to imagine today. Every investigation depended heavily upon physical presence. Officers walked neighborhoods, knocked on doors, interviewed witnesses repeatedly, and relied on memory far more than technology. Maps were spread across desks with colored pins marking locations of interest. Statements were typed, filed, and cross-referenced by hand. Detectives developed instincts through experience, but instinct alone could never replace evidence. When evidence was scarce, patience became their most valuable tool. Yet patience also favored the offender. Each passing day blurred memories. Rain washed away traces left outdoors. Witnesses questioned themselves. Tiny details disappeared forever. In later decades, criminologists would study cases like this to understand how investigative methods evolved. DNA profiling, digital databases, widespread CCTV coverage, mobile phone records, and automated fingerprint comparisons would eventually transform homicide investigations. But none of those tools existed for detectives standing in Manchester during the mid-1970s. They confronted each mystery armed primarily with determination, observation, and persistence. That historical context matters. It does not excuse mistakes. But it explains why some opportunities were recognized only after they had already passed. Meanwhile, the people of Manchester continued building ordinary lives around extraordinary uncertainty. Families gathered for Sunday dinners. Teenagers argued with parents over curfews. Couples planned weddings. New babies were born into neighborhoods where older generations still believed they understood every face on the street. The city refused to surrender its identity to fear, even as fear quietly expanded beneath the surface. Newspaper headlines began occupying conversations that had once focused on football scores or rising prices. Parents exchanged cautious advice. Employers reminded young staff not to leave work alone if it could be avoided. Friends began waiting for one another rather than walking separate routes home. These changes were subtle at first, almost instinctive. No one wanted to admit that daily habits were being reshaped by violence. But they were. Fear rarely arrives all at once. It settles gradually, one conversation at a time. One warning. One rumor. One missing face. Then, almost without anyone noticing, caution becomes routine. The emotional landscape of Manchester changed alongside the physical one. Streets that had once represented independence began carrying uncertainty. A late-night walk no longer felt merely inconvenient or cold. It carried unanswered questions. Every unfamiliar figure approaching from the opposite direction invited a second glance. Every unexpected sound seemed louder than before. And yet, even as anxiety spread, people still had to live. They still had jobs to reach before dawn. They still visited relatives across town. They still celebrated birthdays, attended parties, worked evening shifts, and caught late buses. Life demanded normality even when normality had begun to crack. That tension forms the heart of this story. Because the victims were not doing anything extraordinary. They were participating in the same routines thousands of others followed every single day. Returning home. Meeting friends. Finishing work. Looking forward to tomorrow. Those ordinary moments are precisely what make this case endure in public memory decades later. It forces an uncomfortable realization that tragedy does not always begin with reckless choices or obvious danger. Sometimes it begins with the simple expectation that a familiar journey will end exactly as it always has. As investigators would later discover, the path toward justice would be far longer than anyone hoped. The city would experience grief, frustration, and painful questions before answers finally emerged. There would be missed chances, forensic limitations, and investigative breakthroughs that arrived only after irreversible loss. But before any of that could happen, before detectives connected names, locations, and timelines, before a courtroom heard the full weight of the evidence, 3 families still believed they were living ordinary lives. They had no reason to imagine that history was already moving quietly toward their front doors. And neither did the city around them before their names appeared in police files, newspaper headlines, or courtroom testimony. They belonged only to the people who loved them. They were daughters before they became victims. They were teenagers before they became statistics. And like countless young people growing up in Manchester during the 1970s, they believed the future stretched far beyond the streets they called home. It is easy, when looking back through the lens of a criminal case, to remember only the final chapters of their lives. Dates become more recognizable than birthdays. Crime scene photographs overshadow family albums. The violence threatens to consume every other memory. But that is not where their stories deserve to begin. Their stories begin in ordinary homes where breakfast was served before school, where arguments over untidy bedrooms ended with reluctant smiles, where birthdays were celebrated around crowded tables, and where parents quietly imagined the adults their children would one day become. Those dreams would never have the chance to unfold. Janet Leslie Stewart was only 15 years old. 15. An age balanced delicately between childhood and adulthood, old enough to crave independence but still young enough to return home expecting someone to ask how her evening had been. Like many girls her age, her world was filled with small ambitions rather than grand plans. Friends mattered enormously. Music, conversations, weekend outings, and the excitement of growing older occupied far more space in her thoughts than danger ever did. To those who knew her, she was not defined by tragedy. She was defined by life. She laughed easily, spoke with the confidence that sometimes surprises adults when they realize childhood is beginning to disappear, and looked forward to experiences that most teenagers consider almost guaranteed. Another birthday. More time with friends. A future career. The ordinary milestones that seem limitless when you are 15. She could not have imagined that history would remember her for the worst night of her life instead of the years she had barely begun to live. Her family certainly couldn't. Like countless parents, they worried about ordinary things. Had she dressed warmly enough? Would she remember to come home on time? Was she spending too much time out with friends? These were the familiar concerns of everyday family life, the kind that often seem frustrating to teenagers but comforting in hindsight. They reflected love disguised as routine. Nothing prepared them for the silence that would eventually replace those ordinary conversations. Several months later, another family would find themselves living through a nightmare they never expected to share. Wanda Scala was 17. She stood at the threshold of adulthood, carrying responsibilities that reflected her growing independence. She worked, earned her own money, and was beginning to shape a future built through effort rather than imagination alone. Like many young people in working-class Manchester, employment represented more than income. It represented possibility. A first step toward independence. A chance to contribute. A reason to believe tomorrow could be different from yesterday. Friends remembered her as someone who enjoyed ordinary moments that rarely survive official records. Shared jokes after work. Conversations that wandered from serious dreams to harmless gossip. The familiar rituals of teenagers discovering who they wanted to become. No police report can truly preserve those moments. Evidence catalogues injuries. It does not record laughter. Case files describe clothing. They do not describe favorite songs. Court transcripts establish timelines. They cannot recreate the warmth of a family gathering or the comfort of familiar voices around a dinner table. That is the quiet injustice hidden inside every homicide investigation. The legal process must focus on death. The people left behind spend the rest of their lives remembering how someone lived. By every account, these young women were building ordinary futures. That word ordinary appears again and again throughout this case because it matters. There was nothing reckless about wanting to spend time with friends. Nothing unusual about working an evening shift. Nothing extraordinary about walking through familiar streets toward home. Those routines belonged to thousands of teenagers across Manchester. Most completed them without incident. The victims simply encountered the one person determined to turn an ordinary evening into irreversible tragedy. Long before investigators connected names or examined evidence, families were creating memories they assumed would continue for decades. Parents pictured future weddings. Brothers and sisters imagined years of shared holidays and celebrations. Grandparents expected to watch another generation grow. Hope is rarely dramatic. It lives inside small expectations. Seeing someone walk through the front door. Hearing footsteps on the stairs. Setting another place at the dinner table without ever questioning whether it will be needed. Those expectations feel permanent until a single evening changes everything. When people speak about serial murder, attention often gravitates toward the offender. Psychologists analyze motives. Journalists describe methods. Documentaries reconstruct investigations. Yet the true measure of these crimes lies elsewhere. It exists inside the lives interrupted. Inside bedrooms left untouched. Inside family photographs that suddenly become impossible to look at without imagining everything that should have happened afterward. Janet and Wanda were not connected by friendship. They did not know that history would eventually place their names beside one another. They shared only the ordinary confidence of young women living their lives, believing that tomorrow would arrive much like today. It is impossible to understand the weight of what happened without first understanding what was taken. Not simply lives, but futures. Future conversations. Future celebrations. Future versions of themselves that no one would ever have the privilege to know. As Manchester continued moving through the seasons, another 17-year-old was also building her own plans, surrounded by family, friends, and the quiet certainty that life, despite its challenges, was moving forward. Her name was Sharon Mosoff. She had no way of knowing that her story, too, would become inseparable from the others, or that together, the three young women would come to symbolize one of the darkest chapters in Manchester's criminal history. Sharon Mosoff was 17 years old, an age when the future feels close enough to imagine but distant enough to shape. Like many young women growing up in Manchester during the 1970s, she had begun stepping into adulthood one careful decision at a time. Work had become part of her daily routine. Responsibilities that once belonged to her parents were slowly becoming her own. Every paycheck represented more than money. It represented independence, confidence, and the quiet satisfaction of building a life through her own efforts. Those who knew Sharon remembered an ordinary young woman with ordinary hopes. She laughed with friends. She made plans for weekends. She worried about work, about clothes, about the countless small concerns that seem enormous at 17 and wonderfully insignificant in hindsight. Nothing about her life suggested she would one day become the subject of newspaper headlines. Nothing about her future appeared uncertain. Like Janet and Wanda before her, Sharon belonged to a family whose routines were built around familiar expectations. Mornings began with hurried conversations before work. Evenings ended with questions about the day. Meals were shared whenever schedules allowed. These moments rarely seemed remarkable while they were happening. Families seldom realize they are creating memories. They simply live them. Only after loss do ordinary evenings become priceless. Only after silence do people remember the exact sound of someone's footsteps entering the house. Parents often remember details no one else notices. The way their daughter tossed her coat over a chair instead of hanging it properly. The expression she wore when she was trying to hide excitement. The familiar phrase she used before leaving home. Tiny habits repeated hundreds of times until they quietly became part of everyday life. Those habits disappear instantly after tragedy. The memories remain forever. What united Janet, Wanda, and Sharon was not simply their age. It was the stage of life they occupied. Each stood on the edge of adulthood. Each was beginning to make independent choices while still relying on the comfort of home. Each believed, as almost every young person does, that tomorrow was waiting patiently. There were birthdays still to celebrate. Jobs to change. Relationships to discover. Dreams to chase. Families to build. Possibilities seemed endless because youth naturally assumes there will always be more time. That assumption is one of life's greatest gifts. It is also one of its greatest vulnerabilities. Serial murder steals far more than individual lives. It erases futures before they have the chance to exist. In every case like this, investigators document what happened. Families spend decades imagining what never did. Would Janet have become a mother? Would Wanda have continued building the career she had only begun? What kind of woman would Sharon have become at 30, 40, or 60 years old? There are no answers. Only questions that grow heavier with time. When homicide cases become widely known, victims sometimes risk being remembered only through the circumstances of their deaths. Photographs taken for missing person appeals become the images history preserves. Their names become attached to dates and evidence rather than birthdays and achievements. That is why it is important to pause here. Before the violence. Before the investigations. Before courtrooms and prison sentences. Because these young women lived full lives before they were ever drawn into a criminal case. They had favorite places, favorite music, people who made them laugh, dreams they discussed with friends, concerns that now seem heartbreakingly ordinary. Perhaps they complained about work after a long shift. Perhaps they argued gently with parents over curfews. Perhaps they imagined moving into homes of their own one day. These are the invisible chapters missing from police reports, yet they are the chapters that mattered most to those who loved them. The families did not lose symbols. They lost daughters. For the parents, grief arrived in stages that no one can prepare for. First came confusion. Then worry. Then fear. Finally, the unbearable confirmation that hope had been replaced by certainty. From that moment onward, life divided into two separate histories. Everything before. Everything after. The calendar continued moving. Birthdays still appeared each year. Christmas decorations still returned every winter. But every celebration now contained an empty space that could never truly be filled. Time does not erase grief. It teaches people how to carry it. The city would eventually learn the names Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff because investigators needed the public's help and journalists needed to report the facts. Yet behind every headline stood families who would gladly have traded every newspaper article, every court transcript, every moment of public attention for one simple miracle. Another ordinary evening. Another safe journey home. Another chance to hear the front door open. As the investigation unfolded, detectives would gather evidence designed to reconstruct the victim's final hours. They would examine where each young woman had been, whom they had spoken with, what routes they had taken, and what choices had brought them to the places where their lives were stolen. Those final hours mattered enormously to the case. But they represented only a fraction of who these young women truly were. The rest of their lives, the laughter, the friendships, the family traditions, the hopes carried quietly into adulthood, could never be entered into evidence. They survived only in memory. And memory, unlike forensic science, cannot be measured or catalogued. It exists in fragments. A smile captured in a faded photograph. A birthday card tucked inside a drawer. A familiar perfume lingering on a scarf that no one had the heart to throw away. A seat at the dinner table that somehow continued to feel occupied long after it became empty. Those fragments became priceless because they were all that remained. The tragedy of this case is not simply that 3 lives ended. It is that 3 futures disappeared before they had the opportunity to unfold. 3 families entered one of the darkest chapters imaginable without warning. 3 communities discovered that violence could reach even the most ordinary streets. And somewhere, while those families still believed tomorrow would be like every other day, a man was already moving through Manchester, carrying within him the violence that would bind these strangers together forever. None of them knew his name. None of them had any reason to fear the ordinary face they might pass in the darkness. That would change soon enough. The ordinary lives of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff were about to collide with extraordinary evil, setting into motion a chain of events that would leave scars on Manchester for decades to come. The hardest thing to understand about cases like this is not how a person becomes a victim. It is remembering that, for most of their lives, they were never victims at all. They were simply young women living ordinary days. They woke up in the morning with plans. They worried about small things. They laughed at jokes that no one else understood. They made decisions that felt insignificant at the time because they had no reason to believe those moments would become the final pages of their stories. History often compresses human lives into a few sentences. A name. A date. A tragedy. But a life cannot be measured that way. A person is made from thousands of invisible moments that never appear in official records. The conversations in kitchens. The smiles exchanged between friends. The dreams spoken aloud only once. The private hopes carried silently into the future. Those were the parts of Janet Stewart, Wanda Scala, and Sharon Mosoff that violence could never take away. Janet was 15 when she disappeared. At 15, the world is still full of firsts. The first serious ideas about the future. The first feelings of independence. The first moments when a young person begins to understand that life will eventually extend beyond school, family, and childhood routines. There is a particular kind of uncertainty that belongs only to that age. A person is old enough to imagine the future but too young to understand how fragile it can be. Janet should have had time to discover herself. She should have had years of ordinary experiences that most people never think twice about because they happen naturally. More birthdays. More friendships. More arguments and reconciliations. More moments when she would look back and realize how much she had changed. Instead, her story became connected forever to one of Manchester's most disturbing criminal cases. But her identity was never meant to be defined by the person who ended her life. The same is true of Wanda. At 17, Wanda stood at a different point on that same journey. She was no longer a child, yet she was still only beginning to understand the possibilities ahead. Work had introduced her to a wider world. Each day brought new interactions, new responsibilities, and new experiences beyond the boundaries of home. For many teenagers in the 1970s, employment was a major step toward adulthood. It meant earning money, making decisions, and gaining confidence. It meant proving to themselves and others that they were becoming capable of standing on their own. Those small steps mattered. They were signs of growth. Signs of a future taking shape. No one beginning a normal workday imagines that it could become their last. No one leaving a workplace expects the journey home to become dangerous. That assumption that the world will continue following familiar rules is something almost everyone shares. It is part of being human. Sharon was also 17 when her life was cut short. Like Janet and Wanda, she belonged to a generation growing up in a changing Britain. The country around her was facing uncertainty, but young people continued doing what young people have always done. They made friends. They celebrated milestones. They looked ahead. They created moments that felt permanent. A party with colleagues. A conversation that lasted longer than expected. A simple evening that seemed no different from countless others. The cruel reality of this case is that the moments leading to tragedy were not dramatic. They were ordinary. That is what makes them painful to revisit. There was no clear warning that separated a safe evening from a dangerous one. There was no obvious sign that told these young women they were walking toward a moment that would change everything. The danger came disguised as normal life. And that is why the impact extended far beyond 3 families. Manchester itself began to feel different. People who had once trusted familiar streets began questioning them. Parents who had accepted small risks as part of growing up began imagining worst-case scenarios. A simple walk home became something people discussed. A late shift became something families worried about. A stranger's presence became something noticed rather than ignored. Fear changes communities quietly. It does not always arrive with panic. Sometimes it appears as a mother waiting by the window a little longer than usual. Sometimes it appears as a friend saying, "I'll walk with you." Sometimes it appears as a person looking over their shoulder on a street they have known for years. The investigation into Trevor Hardy would eventually focus on evidence, timelines, and the actions of one man. But before detectives could search for answers, families were searching for something much more basic. They were searching for their daughters. They were searching for explanations. They were searching for a reason that could make an impossible situation feel understandable. There is a particular cruelty in missing person cases. The uncertainty creates its own form of suffering. Every phone call brings a moment of hope. Every passing hour brings another wave of fear. Families are trapped between 2 unbearable possibilities, believing their loved one is gone, or continuing to hope while sensing the truth approaching. That emotional space can last days, weeks, or longer. And during that time, life becomes suspended. Meals are prepared but barely eaten. Sleep becomes difficult. Every sound outside creates a sudden rush of expectation. Maybe it is her. Maybe the phone is about to ring. Maybe there has been a mistake. Hope can be painful because it keeps the door open even when reality is slowly closing it. For the families of Janet, Wanda, and Sharon, The years afterward would be defined by remembrance. They would carry photographs, stories, and memories of the young women they knew before the world knew their names. They would remember birthdays rather than anniversaries of death. They would remember laughter rather than headlines. They would remember who they were. And that is the most important part of their story. Because a killer can take someone's future. A criminal investigation can preserve evidence of their final moments. But neither can erase the person who existed before tragedy. Janet Stewart was more than a name in a case file. Wanda Scala was more than a victim listed in a courtroom. Sharon Mosoff was more than the final chapter written by someone else. They were 3 young women with lives that mattered. 3 families who loved them. 3 futures that should have continued. And as the investigation moved forward, detectives would begin uncovering the disturbing truth that these tragedies were not isolated accidents of fate. They were connected. Behind the separate disappearances was a single man. A single pattern. A single threat moving through Manchester unnoticed. The city was about to discover that the danger had been much closer than anyone imagined. The night Janet Leslie Stewart disappeared began like countless other nights in Manchester. There was no warning written across the sky. No moment when the world seemed to pause and announce that something terrible was approaching. The streets looked the same as they always had. The houses stood quietly behind their curtains. The lamps along the roads cast the same weak pools of yellow light onto the pavement. People were finishing their evenings, closing doors, turning down televisions, and preparing for another ordinary day. For Janet, it should have been just another memory. She was 15 years old, still at an age where life was shaped by small moments. Conversations with friends. Plans for the next day. The excitement of growing older. The simple freedom of being allowed to spend time away from home and return afterward to the safety of familiar walls. No one who saw her that evening could have known they were witnessing the final hours of a young girl whose name would later become connected to one of Manchester's most disturbing murder investigations. That is one of the cruelest aspects of violent crime. The moments before tragedy rarely look like tragedy. They look ordinary. Janet's disappearance occurred around the end of 1974, during a period when the city was already wrapped in winter darkness. The days were short. The evenings arrived quickly. Streets that were busy during daylight became quieter as temperatures dropped and people retreated indoors. Manchester at that time was a city of routines. Workers returned home after shifts. Families gathered for evening meals. Young people met friends before eventually making their way back. A 15-year-old girl being away from home for a period of time was not unusual. Parents understood that growing up involved independence. They could worry, but they also had to trust. That trust is something many families of that era shared. There were no mobile phones. No instant messages. No way to check someone's location. If a child was late coming home, families waited. They listened for the sound of the front door opening. They looked toward the street whenever footsteps passed outside. They hoped for a simple explanation. A delayed conversation. A missed bus. A friend whose plans changed at the last minute. But as the hours passed, the feeling inside Janet's family began to shift. Concern slowly replaced patience. The ordinary explanations became harder to believe. Something was wrong. The investigation into Janet's disappearance would later reveal that she had crossed paths with Trevor Hardy, a man who had already begun moving toward violence. At the time, however, there was no reason for anyone searching for her to suspect that they were looking for a murderer. There was only a missing teenager. And a family desperate for answers. Behind every missing person report is a final known moment, the last confirmed sighting, the last conversation, the last ordinary action before everything changes. Investigators later worked backward from that point, trying to reconstruct Janet's final movements. They examined where she had been, who might have seen her, and what circumstances could have led her away from safety. But reconstruction can only go so far. The most important question remained unanswered. What happened during the moments when no one was watching? According to the later confession and evidence presented after Hardy's arrest, Janet was attacked and killed by him. Her death was not the result of a sudden accident or a random confrontation that spiraled beyond control. It was the beginning of a pattern of violence that would eventually expose the existence of a dangerous offender operating within the city. The details of the crime are deeply disturbing, but the significance of Janet's case extends beyond the act itself. Her disappearance marked the beginning of a nightmare that would continue for more than a year. At the time, no one knew that. No detective looking through early reports could see the future. No family member could imagine that Janet's name would later be placed alongside other young women who had suffered similar fates. The tragedy of investigations like this is that patterns often become visible only after lives have already been lost. Before the pattern exists, there are only individual events. A missing girl. An unanswered question. A desperate search. The weeks following Janet's disappearance were filled with uncertainty. For her family, every possibility had to be considered. They had to hold on to hope while confronting the growing fear that something far worse had happened. That emotional conflict is almost impossible to describe. A person can prepare themselves for many kinds of pain. They can understand illness. They can understand accidents. But disappearance creates a unique kind of suffering because it leaves the mind trapped between hope and despair. There is no clear ending. Only waiting. Only wondering. Only imagining possibilities that become harder to bear with each passing day. Meanwhile, the man responsible continued living his life. That fact would later become one of the most haunting elements of the case. While a family searched desperately for Janet, while investigators tried to understand what had happened, Hardy remained part of the same society that was looking for answers. He was not hidden away in some distant place. He was close. He was among ordinary people. He existed in the same city where fear and grief were beginning to grow. This contrast, the suffering of those searching and the normality of the person responsible, would become a recurring theme throughout the investigation. The outside world continued moving. Businesses opened. People went to work. Neighbors carried on with daily conversations. But inside one family, time had stopped. A missing child's room does not feel like an empty room. It feels like a room waiting. Clothes remain where they were left. Personal belongings remain untouched. The possibility of return hangs in the air because accepting the alternative feels impossible. For Janet's loved ones, that hope would eventually be replaced by devastating truth. Her body was not discovered immediately. For a period of time, she existed only as a question. Where was she? Who had taken her? Would she come home? The answers would come later, after Hardy's eventual arrest and confession revealed what had happened. He would lead investigators to the location where Janet had been buried in Newton Heath, finally providing the information her family had been waiting for, but not the information they had prayed to receive. The discovery would bring an end to uncertainty. But it could not bring back the person they had lost. And somewhere in the timeline of this case, before investigators understood the full scale of what they were dealing with, another terrible truth was waiting. Janet Stewart was not the only young woman whose life would be taken. Her name was the first chapter in a story Manchester never wanted to read. And Trevor Hardy had not finished. The disappearance of Janet Stewart left behind a silence that no family should ever have to experience. At first, there was still the possibility that she would return. That possibility is what keeps families searching. It is what keeps lights on late into the night, what keeps people checking the telephone, what keeps them listening for a familiar voice outside the front door. The mind refuses to accept the worst outcome because accepting it means accepting something permanent. And permanence is the most terrifying part of loss. For Janet's family, the days following her disappearance were not simply a period of waiting. They were a constant battle between hope and fear. Every unanswered question carried weight. Every passing day without news changed the meaning of the silence. A missing teenager is not just a missing person. She is someone's daughter. Someone's friend. Someone whose place at the dinner table remains empty. Someone whose belongings remain exactly where they were left. The investigation began without the knowledge that detectives would eventually uncover a serial killer. At that stage, there was no clear connection to other crimes. No obvious pattern. No reason to believe that Janet had become the first known victim of a man who would later be described as one of Manchester's most notorious murderers. That uncertainty shaped everything. Police investigations are built on information. But in the early days of Janet's disappearance, information was painfully limited. There were questions, but few answers. There were possibilities, but little certainty. Every missing person case begins with a search for facts. Investigators try to understand the person's movements, their relationships, their habits, and anything unusual that may have happened before they vanished. They speak with family members and friends, hoping someone remembers a detail that could unlock the mystery. Sometimes it is a forgotten conversation. Sometimes it is a strange encounter. Sometimes it is a small detail that seemed meaningless at the time but later becomes the key. But sometimes, the truth remains hidden. And when the truth is hidden, time becomes the enemy. The person responsible for Janet's death had chosen a place where he believed the evidence would remain concealed. He had attempted to remove her from view, to separate her from the world that was searching for her. For months, Janet remained missing. Her name existed in uncertainty. Her family had no grave to visit. No place to mourn. No final goodbye. Only questions. The later revelation of what happened would be horrifying not only because of the violence involved, but because of the realization that the answer had been nearby all along. Janet had not simply disappeared. She had been taken from the world by someone who understood how easily a person could vanish within a large city. Trevor Hardy's actions revealed a disturbing pattern that would become clearer over time. He did not choose victims from a world separate from his own. He found opportunities among ordinary circumstances. His crimes developed in the spaces between routine and vulnerability, the moments when someone was traveling home, walking alone, or simply existing without expecting danger. That is what made the case so frightening. The victims were not living dangerously. They were living normally. And normal life became the setting for unimaginable violence. The investigation into Janet's death would remain incomplete until Hardy himself eventually revealed the truth. But before that confession came, another young woman would disappear, creating another family nightmare and another unanswered question for detectives. The city did not yet understand that it was facing one offender. Instead, it was dealing with separate tragedies, each one demanding immediate attention, each one surrounded by its own uncertainty. This is one of the most difficult realities of criminal investigations. The truth often appears obvious only after it is discovered. Before that moment, investigators are forced to navigate darkness. They must decide which paths to follow and which possibilities to set aside. Every decision carries consequences, but those consequences are impossible to see in advance. The investigators searching for Janet were not looking at a completed story. They were looking at the opening pages. They did not know there would be more victims. They did not know the same man would eventually become the center of a much larger investigation. They did not know that a confession years later would reveal details that had remained hidden beneath the surface. They only knew that a 15-year-old girl was gone. And someone had to find out why. The tragedy of Janet's case is also found in the contrast between her final moments and the life she should have had afterward. At 15, the future is still mostly unwritten. There are countless paths a person might take. A child becomes an adult. A student discovers a passion. A teenager becomes a partner, a parent, a friend, a professional. Every year brings new versions of who they might become. When a young life is taken, those possibilities disappear silently. There is no photograph of the future. No record of conversations that never happened. No evidence exhibit containing dreams. Only absence. That absence became the lasting legacy of Janet's disappearance. Not the headlines. Not the investigation files. Not the criminal who would later be remembered. But the empty space left behind. Months would pass before the truth emerged. Months during which the city continued moving. People went to work. Children attended school. Families celebrated holidays. Life continued in Manchester, unaware that beneath the surface, a horrifying connection was waiting to be uncovered. Then came another disappearance. Another young woman. Another family asking the same impossible questions. And slowly, the darkness surrounding Janet Stewart's case would begin to reveal something far more terrifying. She had not been an isolated tragedy. She had been the beginning. The most frightening thing about a predator is not always the violence itself. It is the ability to return to ordinary life afterward. After Janet Stewart disappeared, Manchester did not suddenly transform into a city under siege. There were no immediate signs that a murderer was walking among its residents. No alarms sounded. No streets were closed. No one knew that an ordinary-looking man had carried out an extraordinary act of cruelty and then stepped back into the world as if nothing had happened. That is what made the coming months so dangerous. The city continued trusting its routines. And Trevor Hardy continued existing within them. To those around him, there was no obvious transformation. There was no public confession, no dramatic behavior that immediately revealed what he had done. The world outside his own thoughts continued unaware of the secret he carried. Meanwhile, Janet's absence remained a wound that would not close. For her family, the passage of time did not bring peace. Time can sometimes soften memories of ordinary difficulties. A lost job. A broken relationship. A painful argument. Life moves forward and slowly creates distance. But when someone disappears, time often does the opposite. Every day without an answer creates another unanswered question. Every birthday becomes another reminder. Every holiday becomes another moment when someone should have been present but was not. The human mind searches endlessly for explanations. Families revisit conversations. They examine the final moments they shared. They wonder whether they missed a warning sign, whether a different decision could have changed everything. That search for meaning is part of grief. People need to understand what happened, even when the truth is unbearable. But in Janet's case, the truth remained hidden. Her family did not know where she was. They did not know who had taken her. They did not know that the answer was connected to a man who would later confess to multiple murders. The uncertainty itself became a punishment. While investigators continued searching, the city remained unaware of the danger that had already appeared within it. The person responsible was not an outsider who had vanished after committing the crime. He remained nearby, surrounded by the same streets, the same buildings, and the same communities affected by the tragedy. This closeness would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. The idea that someone capable of such violence could continue participating in ordinary life was difficult for many people to comprehend. But that is often the reality of serious offenders. They do not always look different. They do not always behave differently. They can stand in a shop queue, walk down a street, or sit among neighbors without anyone realizing the danger hidden beneath the surface. The image of a criminal is often created after the crime. Before discovery, there is only a person. And that person can remain invisible. As months passed, the investigation into Janet's disappearance remained unresolved. Without a body, without a confession, and without a clear suspect, detectives faced the difficult task of searching through possibilities. Every missing person investigation contains uncertainty, but cases involving young victims carry a particular urgency because investigators understand that time can determine whether answers are found. The first hours matter. The first days matter. But when those moments pass without resolution, the search becomes increasingly difficult. Evidence disappears. Memories fade. Witnesses become harder to locate. And the person responsible gains confidence. For Hardy, that confidence would eventually become a fatal mistake. Because while he believed he had hidden the truth, he carried something far more dangerous than physical evidence. He carried a pattern. And patterns reveal themselves over time. The attack on Janet was not the end of his violence. It was the beginning of a sequence that would eventually expose him. Several months later, another young woman would vanish. Her name was Wanda Scala. Like Janet, she was young. Like Janet, She was living an ordinary life. Like Janet, she had no reason to believe that a simple journey through familiar surroundings would become a moment of unimaginable danger. The similarities between the cases would not immediately be obvious. At first, they existed as separate tragedies. Different locations. Different circumstances. Different families experiencing the same unbearable fear. But beneath the surface, the same person was responsible. The same violent mind had created two nightmares. The investigation would later reveal that Hardy's crimes were not random explosions of anger. They involved planning, opportunity, and a willingness to manipulate circumstances in order to avoid detection. He understood that missing people create confusion. He understood that without immediate answers, investigators had to work through uncertainty. And uncertainty gave him time. Time was the one thing that allowed him to continue. The case of Janet Stewart therefore represents more than the first confirmed murder connected to Trevor Hardy. It represents the beginning of a failure that would haunt the investigation. A failure to see the danger before it could strike again. Of course, that judgment is much easier to make with decades of hindsight. Modern audiences know the full story. They know the name Trevor Hardy. They know the crimes that followed. The detectives of the 1970s did not have that knowledge. They were working inside the darkness. They were searching for a person they could not yet identify. They were trying to solve a mystery before they knew it was part of something larger. That is the painful structure of many true crime cases. The answers often arrive after the damage is done. By the time the full picture becomes visible, someone is already missing. Someone is already grieving. Someone is already asking why the warning signs were not recognized sooner. For Janet's family, there would eventually be an answer. But it would not be the answer they wanted. It would come through the words of the man responsible. It would lead investigators to the place where her remains had been hidden. And it would confirm the nightmare they had spent months trying not to imagine. Janet Stewart was never coming home. The city that had searched for her would finally learn the truth. But the truth would bring no comfort. Because solving a mystery and healing a loss are two completely different things. Justice can identify the person responsible. It can establish facts. It can create accountability. But it cannot return the person who was taken. And while Manchester was still trying to understand what had happened to Janet, another family was beginning the same devastating journey. Another empty room. Another unanswered phone call. Another mother, father, and community hoping that this time, the story would end differently. It would not. The shadow that had fallen over Manchester was not finished moving. For investigators, every crime scene begins with a question. Not the question everyone wants answered. Not who did this. That comes later. The first question is simpler and, in many ways, more difficult. What happened here? A location where violence has occurred is a place where the past and present collide. To most people, it may appear to be nothing more than a patch of ground, an empty building site, a stretch of water, or a quiet corner of a city. But for detectives, every detail carries meaning. A footprint. A discarded object. A disturbance in the earth. A mark left behind by someone who believed they would never be discovered. In the case of Janet Stewart, there was no immediate crime scene waiting for investigators. There was only absence. For months, Janet existed in the painful space between being missing and being found. Her family had no place to visit. No final moment of certainty. No location where they could understand what had happened. There was only the unanswered question that followed them every day. Where was Janet? The answer would eventually come from the person responsible. Trevor Hardy's confession would transform the case from a disappearance into a murder investigation. His words would finally provide investigators with what they had been searching for, the location where Janet's remains had been hidden. But finding the truth and facing the truth are two very different things. For detectives, the confession was a breakthrough. For Janet's family, it was the moment hope was finally taken away. The location Hardy revealed was in Newton Heath, an area of Manchester shaped by the city's industrial history. Like many parts of the region, It carried the marks of decades of development and change. Old industrial spaces existed beside residential areas. Empty plots of land waited for redevelopment. Places that appeared forgotten by the wider world still existed within the daily lives of local residents. It was precisely the kind of place where someone could believe a secret might remain buried. The discovery of Janet's remains confirmed the terrible reality that investigators and family members had feared. She had not simply vanished. She had been murdered. The moment a missing person case becomes a homicide investigation is a devastating turning point. Before that moment, every possibility remains open. Afterward, the world narrows into one painful truth. Someone chose to end a life. Someone made decisions that could never be undone. Someone took away a future. For forensic investigators, the discovery of remains begins a careful process of examination. Every action must be deliberate. Every piece of evidence must be preserved. The goal is not only to understand how someone died but also to reconstruct what happened before, during, and after the crime. In the 1970s, those investigations looked very different from today. There was no advanced DNA profiling. No digital databases capable of instantly connecting evidence. No modern surveillance systems tracking movements through a city. Detectives depended on traditional methods, careful observation, witness interviews, physical evidence, and painstaking reconstruction. The smallest details mattered. The position of objects. The condition of the surrounding area. The timeline created from available information. A single overlooked detail could become the difference between a case remaining unsolved and a criminal being identified. For Janet's family, however, forensic details could never capture the full reality of what had been lost. To investigators, the location represented evidence. To them, it represented something much more painful. It was the place where their daughter had been hidden away. The place where the final moments of her life had occurred. The place that proved their worst fears were true. This is one of the cruel contradictions of criminal investigations. The evidence that helps bring justice often causes the deepest pain to those who loved the victim. Every discovery moves the investigation forward, but every discovery also creates another wound. The recovery of Janet's remains provided answers. But answers can be devastating. Families of missing people often describe uncertainty as unbearable, yet certainty carries its own kind of suffering. Hope disappears completely. The possibility of a different ending is gone forever. There would be no return. No explanation that could make the situation less tragic. Only the reality that Janet's life had been taken. As detectives examined the circumstances surrounding her death, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Hardy's confession did not describe a random accident. It revealed deliberate violence and an attempt to conceal what he had done. The discovery also changed the way investigators viewed Hardy himself. Before the confession, he was connected to one murder. Afterward, detectives began looking deeper. They began asking questions. Were there other victims? Had Janet been the beginning of something larger? The answers would soon reveal that the case was far more horrifying than anyone had initially understood. Because criminals rarely reveal the full extent of their actions immediately. Sometimes evidence reveals what a suspect refuses to admit. Sometimes another family comes forward with a story that suddenly fits. Sometimes a single confession opens the door to a much larger investigation. That is what happened with Trevor Hardy. The discovery of Janet Stewart did not close the case. It opened it. The investigation expanded from finding a missing teenager to understanding the behavior of a man capable of repeated violence. Detectives now had to examine his movements, his relationships, his statements, and his possible connections to other unsolved disappearances. Every detail of Hardy's past became important. Every conversation was reconsidered. Every previous suspicion was revisited. A person who had once appeared as an individual suspect now became the center of a much larger question. How many lives had been affected by his actions? The answer would lead investigators toward two more young women. Wanda Scala. Sharon Mosoff. Two names that would transform the case from a single tragedy into one of Manchester's most disturbing murder investigations. But before those connections were fully understood, detectives had to confront a painful reality. There had been opportunities to stop Hardy earlier. There had been moments when suspicion had come close. And somewhere within those missed chances existed the possibility that another life might have been saved. The discovery of Janet Stewart was therefore not only a moment of justice. It was also a moment of reflection. A reminder that investigations are shaped not only by the evidence found, but also by the evidence missed. Not only by the questions asked, but by the questions that were never considered. For Janet, the search had finally ended. For investigators, the real work was just beginning. Because beneath the soil in Newton Heath was not only the answer to one family's nightmare. It was the first piece of a much darker puzzle.